Let's keep you posted on some of the other agreements and deals that were done last night after we got off the air. Funny how that happens. PJ Tucker, we know we love his game, gives some toughness to Houston. Kyle Korver at his age getting 3 years. Nene, we're going to talk to our capologist Eric to explain how that deal went from 4 to not allowed to 3. We talked about Jody Meeks, but I want to get to Taj Gibson because the band getting back together, that's what Tibbs is trying to do, Stu, to bring them back together. You've got Jimmy Butler, you've got Teague. Millsap, they backed out, didn't want to spend all that money. How much do you feel like they've gotten better, and do you like the fit of Taj Gibson?
Well, I do like the fit, and if I'm Tom Thibodeau, I just spent a season with a young group of very talented players, spending most of that season pleading with them to defend and to continue to be professional and get better and develop. And what that yielded was a very talented team that lost leads throughout the second half. They're 29th in the league in giving up points in the third period. So what I do by bringing in Teague, Butler, and now Gibson is I'm changing the culture of my team to a more veteran atmosphere. And oh, by the way, to a more defensive-oriented atmosphere when you talk about Butler and Gibson. For these young guys to obviously feed off, learn from, so that I don't give up leads and I perform a little bit better coming out of the locker room. And that way I've maybe taken a jump with this basketball team so that they're a consistent playoff team.
You know, Smitty, we talk about the Wolves. They're not done. They're still in on Rudy Gay. They're in on C.J. Miles. They're continuing to work. There'll be a lot of new players in camp. You had a situation, you moved. I mean, when you get to Portland, you get to all these new guys. How long into the season before a group like this that has never played together all finds a way to come together?
I think faster, just on what Stu said. You bring two guys that understand Tibbs. And as we know, Tibbs is one of those guys that you're looking at him. If I was a young guy, I'd be, I might not want to play for him. But if you had two veterans that's been through it and the versatility defensively they can have, you look at that lineup one just when we got a chance to show. Butler, Wiggins, Taj, and Karl Anthony Towns, 2 through 5, they all can switch for just a second. And it's always about being able to hold up a guy for a second. I think defensively they're going to be off the chain. You said it best, Sue. They had 46 games where they led by double digits, and they lost 22 of them. If they can just cut that in half, they have a chance to make some noise. And so I think with Jeff Teague, a guy who can change pace, I think that'll give them some easy buckets. He's not the passer as Rubio, but I think his being able to break down guys, get into the lane, will give those guys some easy shots.
I was going to ask you a follow on that. We were talking about this earlier. Is the irony that, and look, Rubio has shot better down the stretch of last season. Jeff Teague's a good player. He's been an all-star caliber player. But with the pieces they now brought in, Stu, would Rubio have been actually a better fit at the point than Teague is?
Well, I just like the way Rubio ended the second half of the season last year. He started to shoot the ball a little bit more, a little bit better, and more frequently and more willingly, which I like just in terms of his development. And Ricky Rubio, I think he's one of the best passers in the NBA, no matter where he is. And you can make an argument that he would have been just as good for this team as Jeff Teague. But that's the Minnesota Timberwolves' decision to make, to me, Smitty. But the interesting part about the T-Wolves now going forward, we talked about it earlier with respect to some other teams, is how does their chemistry fit?
Yes.
Because as I look at this team on paper, I'm going to say something rash.
Yes.
Their best two players are Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins. What does that do for a guy like Jimmy Butler? Because from a talent standpoint, it's their basketball team, but now you bring in an all-star like Jimmy Butler, and dare I say, I think he's the third spoke on the wheel there next to those other two, and how do they really mix?
And it comes over from being the man, where it was totally the opposite situation in Chicago. So.
Yeah, and I'm with Stu. I look at Jimmy Butler right now. It's a time to really reflect and understand where you are as a player and what your role will be on this team. He's a very nice player. He's an all-star in the Eastern Conference, probably won't be an all-star in the Western Conference. He works hard. I think the challenge for him is, what type of leader does he want to be? What type of player does he really have to look in the mirror and say, this team, to me, I said it on draft night, this is Karl Anthony Towns' team. And I think from a leadership standpoint, the young kid gets it. From a basketball standpoint, I think Jimmy Butler has to come in, even with the relationship of Tibbs, just add to Karl Anthony Towns, not try to be the guy that's telling him what to do. Just let him be the leader. Just help him in a quiet way versus being that vocal leader. He has to be the guy, Jimmy Butler. The way he approaches this, Stu, it goes this way or it goes that way.
One thing I want to ask you, and I want to get to Nene, who was on that list on the financial side. but credibility is so important for players and respect. Last year, Tibbs, I don't think he smiled once the whole season, which is not rare, but they weren't winning. Kids didn't look happy. When Jimmy Butler comes into camp and starts telling Wiggins and Towns and their younger players to, hey, look, we've seen that it works. We were on a team where this guy did all this kind of stuff, but how much does that help? Maybe Butler off the court being a guy who's a selling point of what Tibbs could do help some of the young kids.
Listen, the success of any NBA team, Smitty, you can attest to this. Any coach in the NBA is only as good as his internal leadership. And when you have strong internal leadership, which Jimmy Butler has the ability to be, or Taj Gibson, having been with Tibbs before in Chicago, they provide that buffer. You know, and Tibbs is not an easy guy to play for. He would say that himself. But they provide that buffer between those young players and Tibbs in an effort to just keep the train on track until they can, you know, experience the real, true fruits of their labor. And it's going to take some time to get defensively where they need to be and offensively. But if you got a Butler and you got a Taj Gibson in your ear, it certainly helps Tom Thibodeau.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, it might take the time here, times 10, to try and explain or understand what happened with Nene, because we saw he had 4 years in 15 that he didn't, then he was mad, and then there was a whole conversation about would he be happy enough and okay, and it all ends up in 3 years and $11 million. So let's get our capologist and the man in the know, and Eric Pincus. So take us through. A lot of people probably read this, and they're sitting there reading on websites trying to understand, but give us in simple terms, why didn't this work? What mistake was made, and how did they fix it?
Well, it's the actual rule here that makes sense. It's really designed to prevent what they were doing here. He was born on September 13th, 1982. And so when that season, that fourth season starts, he'll be 39 by just about a month or so, right? A few weeks. So that's where they messed up. And the idea is that, is he really going to play those 4 years? The reality is Nene will probably play a couple years and then maybe sort of wind it down. He's late in his career. Maybe he goes, maybe he's Vince Carter and plays until he's 40, 45, 50, right? But reality is you don't want to backload the contract, pay him when he's not playing anymore. So that's really what happened there. He was just too old at that time. There's a 38-year-old rule, and they crossed that line just by 3 or 4 weeks. So now had to renegotiate, bring it down. He lost $4 million basically because he's about 3 or 4 weeks too old.
So you're saying the way Vince Carter is playing, maybe we need to relook at this rule. Maybe we have like the rule at 43.
Well, it just got pushed up.
38.
It's been 36 for a very long time.
Right.
Now, who's in charge of the union? Chris Paul, LeBron James. They negotiated I'm not mad at them because they negotiated a deal. We're here because there's no lockout. I'm very happy with what they did, but they made sure that a rule that will apply to them, specifically Chris Paul, who will be in that age range. When he goes to re-sign next year in Houston for 5 years, that 36 rule would have been a problem. Now it's 38. Didn't help Nene. It's going to help Chris Paul.